Hello, I'm Michael Depp, editor of TVNewsCheck, and this is Talking TV, the podcast that brings you smart conversations about the business of broadcasting. Today, that conversation is with Marcus Riley, Senior Director of Content Strategy and Inclusive Journalism at the Scripps Company.
Hello, Michael.
Hello, Marcus. So, Marcus, welcome. You are the Senior Director of Content Strategy and Inclusive Journalism at Scripps. We're going to be talking about what inclusive journalism looks like today, how it's made, and why it's needed. So I appreciate you coming in for that conversation.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So first, can you explain what inclusive journalism means and what your job entails specifically at Scripps?
Yeah, I think inclusive journalism certainly, I might depend on what company that you work for. For me, when I think about inclusive journalism, I think it's making sure that the content that you're doing on an everyday basis is reflective of the communities that you serve, and that the people who are doing that content are actually also reflective of that community. But I think when you look at the history of local TV, we have not always been reflective. So how are we looking at the systems and processes that we have within our newsrooms to make sure that the content that we have is reflective, that we're not letting unconscious bias and other things like that enter into the equation?
And when we talk about inclusion, are we just talking about race, or is this a broader definition of that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, because I think a lot of people always assume that, diversity in your product, that's just Black folks or brown folks. But when we talk about it, we say, who is in your community? This can go down to what parts of the market do you go to on an everyday basis. A lot of times in local TV, whether it's getting MOS or whether it's just going to do a story, a lot of times stations go to the place that's comfortable. Maybe that's the downtown area where that reporter might live, where they know that they're going to kind of find people. We kind of fall into those traps. So we think that the diversity of what your product should be is reflecting the entire community. So that can be socioeconomically, that could be gender, that can be age, as well as race.
Mm-hmm. And I know I've talked to Scripps executives for a couple of years now about this subject, and I know your VP of News, Sean McLaughlin, is very committed to this. But so now, I guess your matriculation into this position is sort of, you own this in a way, right? It's sort of you need to bird dog this across the company and see how it's actually being executed. I wonder, on the side of just the geographic coverage, are your stations pulling out maps and looking at where we're, and just sort of, hey, why haven't we touched this neighborhood? Why are we going over here? And does it come down to that kind of thing?
Yeah, and I think it comes down to putting a system in place in your station where you could actually put a zip code on a story and where it came from. And we're not 100% there, but seeing that data monthly or every other couple of weeks and say, hey, we're too concentrated downtown. And I think another part of that is part of the product audit. So do you have folks, a lot of times at our stations, there are actual EDI committees, and whether that's once a month or once a quarter, where we have people actually looking at those, looking at newscasts to make sure that our content is reflective.
So you're doing those audits pretty regularly now of each newscast?
Some stations are, yes, but we are putting systems in place to where you can actually track it and see it. But I think you need to get your actual station involved in the process. And that's what I love about having a committee that will actually product audit and look at it, and then they feel a little bit more invested.
A committee at the station level?
The committee at the station level, yes.
And so that would be the news director. Who else would be on that committee?
Not even necessarily the news director, because I don't feel that everything should necessarily be top down. I think that the station level, that the actual employees need to kind of own those sorts of things. So you certainly set that strategy from the top and say, this is who we are, and this is how what we believe in when it comes to our diversity and inclusion efforts. And once you kind of have that developed, then you're able to say, okay, now let's look at actual products and get feedback from people at the station level.
And pragmatically speaking, when we talk about more inclusiveness in stories, what does that actually look like on the 5 o'clock or 11 o'clock news? Or are we seeing, does this result in longer pieces? Are they more thoroughly reported? Are they given more turnaround time to put a piece together, to be more thoughtful and aware of this dynamic?
I think that's part of it. I know one example that I shared with you came from our Denver station. They and some of our other stations do a 360 product, which is stories that basically just tell things from multiple perspectives. So that's part of it. That can be a bigger story, can be up to 5 minutes long, where you get a bunch of different voices in the same story. So we'll actually bring that sort of to a social justice beat. And there's a reporter there who kind of works on that. But I think it's more important on an everyday basis. We're about to enter February when this podcast runs, and it's Black History Month. And I think you'll see a lot of Black history stories. That's absolutely important. But to your point, it's what you see at the 5 o'clock news on any given day. And that's where we need to get to the point where seeing diverse faces and voices is just normalized. We've done studies where we've talked to specifically some African-American viewers who told us very specifically, I don't see lawyers, I don't see doctors. These are the people that I know, but they're not reflected on air. When we normalize and just have regular experts and regular people on our air that are diverse, that helps normalize the process even more.
So you're looking at your lists of experts in every city as well, and saying,
Yep.
Because often, I mean, people go back to the same sources again and again and again,
Mm-hmm.
and that's tough to do, to expand and update your Rolodex.
Yep.
So
a diversity Rolodex, I think, is important for any newsroom to have, and because I think we have to be intentional about it. It just is not going to happen. When it just happens, we go back to that same person that we've always talked to before that probably has a better PR person or a PR person. And when we do that and we fall back, then you get a lot of that sameness.
Well, as you mentioned, the pieces I looked at before we talked from Scripps were longer pieces, upwards of 3 minutes. Are we going to see normalization of longer news stories, something that's over 90 seconds in an A block or a B block of local TV news?
Yeah, and I think that's across the board. I don't think it necessarily lends itself to diverse stories per se, but I think audiences are telling us, and we've certainly heard through research, that people are looking for a little bit more depth. I think we've been guilty in the past, certainly of local news, of just pace and urgency and really, really short stories. And when the story lends itself to it, I think people actually want to see a little bit of that process and not just kind of have something go in front of them like really, really quickly. So we have, I think over the years, you've seen more 3-4 minute stories on at a lot of our stations.
So at the station level, where should newsrooms start to think about inclusion in their story process? What does that discussion look like in a morning meeting, or in the reporting, or even the editing process of a story?
Sure. We like to think that it really should happen at the planning process and not necessarily just in the editorial meeting. But where do you get to the point where the reporter is actually thinking about it at the pitch process? When a reporter is thinking about, I'm starting to put this story together. Some of our stations actually have pitch sheets, and a lot of the stations that I work with have younger reporters, and it helps to kind of have a pitch sheet to kind of go through and what is the sell of my story, all of those sorts of things. And we've said that it's important to have a diversity. How is diversity reflected in my story, so that we're already thinking about it at the pitch process. And then we're talking about it in the editorial meeting. And then everybody knows sort of what that expectation is. If I'm going to get MOS, am I just going downtown to get the same thing? Or am I actually going to maybe hit a community that we don't always go to?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So why now? Why is this so important at this moment particularly?
I think it's always been important. I think it's certainly become a little bit more urgent right now because of, say, the state of TV news as an industry. We don't have the viewership that we used to have. And I think historically we've taken a lot of these communities for granted. On a big picture, I think it's about our actual survival. But beyond that, I think it's just the right thing to do. And I think a lot of, whether they be brands or industries, are starting to realize that this is what their audiences are asking them to do. And if we're relying on our audiences to be our customers going forward, that we actually have to be reflective of the communities that we serve.
So if you're successful at your job, how will a typical Scripps newscast look differently at the end of this year?
Well, I think it would look differently, that you would see all of your communities, or a wide swath of communities that are reflected in any show that you see. You'll see diverse voices. I think you'd see diverse people. I don't get into necessarily the recruiting side of things, although I do advise and help with a lot of that. I think a lot of the things will be things that you don't necessarily see. I hope when we talked before that we just normalize a lot of things, that if we're going to talk to an expert, that, oh, that expert just happened to be, female and Asian, or just happened to be, a Black male. And it's not necessarily about, I love the fact that we're doing Black history stories right now, but it doesn't come across, well, it's Black History Month and you have to do that story. Are we in those neighborhoods outside of February? Are we in those neighborhoods when bad things aren't necessarily happening? Are we celebrating our communities because that's the right thing to do?
And as you go, I know you're only about a month or so into this part of your job. You've been in the content strategy side for much longer, but as you're now moving into this position and working with a groups of stations, where are the pain points in executing on what you're trying to do? Where do you get friction?
Sure. I think friction would be the wrong word. I think what we're struggling with a little bit right now is what everybody is struggling with through COVID. So we do have EDI committees at our station, but like anything else, trying to do anything like that and we're not in person can be difficult to do. I think a big part of this is community outreach, whether that's bringing people into a station or going outside of the station to meet people one-on-one, to meet with groups. And we're not bringing people into our stations right now, at least for right now. So that's a little bit more difficult to, when you say that we need to be more community focused, we actually be in the community. We have to actually be in the community. And that's a little bit, that's difficult. I think the other side of it is, let's be honest, we're more polarized as a society right now than perhaps we've ever been. And that's not just outside of a TV station. Some of that can be reflected inside of a TV station as well. But to be a TV station that is telling stories about these big, big issues that we deal with every day, and it's up to us to sort of get through the morass and all of the detail of something and come up with some sort of cogent message. We have to be able to talk to each other. So actually breaking that down within our own stations, making sure that everybody has a voice at the table in the editorial room, trying to recruit and make sure that we actually have diverse people in our newsrooms. There's a lot of things that can kind of get in the way of sort of getting there. But I'll certainly say as a company, I think we're dedicated to it and we're moving in that direction.
Okay, well, Marcus Riley, you have some work cut out for you this year. I'll be very interested to see how the news product keeps evolving at Scripps with what you're doing in mind. So thanks so much for being here today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for the time, Michael. I appreciate it.
Cheers. A new episode of Talking TV is available most Fridays on TVNewsCheck.com. You can also listen and subscribe on YouTube, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, and Spotify.